Francisco d'Ancona.
Watching, we know you.
Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasul al-Karim. Amma ba'd. Welcome, dear viewers, to another episode of Face to Face with me, Azad Ali. Alhamdulillah, today in the studio, I have with me Moazzam Begg, Outreach Director for CAGE. And today, we're going to talk about Syria, in particular, the battle for Idlib. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Jazakumullah khair for joining us. Just before we start, I mean, this war in Syria, the civil war in Syria has been raging for 7 years now. I mean, where do you see the latest development? I mean, where has it got to? So, a few years ago we were seeing like maybe the regime was going to fall, and now it seems opposite. What's happening?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Of course, Syria is a place that is very, very close to my heart. I lived in Idlib between 2012 and 2013 for several months with my family. And we saw what was at that time a beginning of something which felt amazing, and that was that there was a change was going to come. It was part of the Arab Spring that in some places it was succeeding, in other places it wasn't. Syria was quite different because it didn't have any of those kind of interests in terms of oil or other types of revenue that were openly sought by the West. And so in the beginning, and those who know the history of Syria know that this is a place where the Hama uprising happened by the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in 1982, and they were brutally put down. 20,000 people were killed. Hundreds were placed in prison and killed at the rate of 50 to 60 a day in some cases. So that was the backdrop of, and so people in Syria were just looking for a point at which they may be able to rise up. Protesters on the streets, initially a Sha'b Yuri Isqat al-Nizam, that people want to bring down the regime, and peaceful protests, the Assad regime, opened fire on these peaceful protesters. And the rest is history. Women were taken into torture chambers, brutally raped. People were flayed alive, buried alive. Children were, like this famous young boy called Hamza al-Khatib, was skinned by the Assad regime. And terrible atrocities were taking place, barrel bombs, later on the use of chlorine gas, sarin gas, chemical weapons, starvation as a weapon of war.
And it's a brutal and grotesque wars, and by all accounts. I mean, like you said, there was this initial kind of feeling of change, maybe more freedom, a better life for people and everything else. From that, the kind of brutality of war is taking its toll. I mean, who are the main players in this?
I mean, so initially what you had was the Free Syrian Army, which all sorts of people have claimed descriptions of, but essentially it was a group of original soldiers who were part of the Syrian regime, the Syrian army itself, who'd set up resistance units around the country, and then later on different organizations like Harakat Ahrar al-Sham and others who were more Islamically minded joined along. But even the Free Syrian Army described themselves very much in Islamic terms. They had kata'ib or battalions called Battalion 313. Why they're called 313? Because of the 313 people who fought at Badr. And these were just simple examples in terms of how the West may say these were a Western kind of, they wanted democracy, but they saw themselves very much in Islamic, in the terms of Islamic resistance. And so there was that. Of course, there were different groups. There was Jabhat al-Nusra, who was kind of more Al-Qaeda. There was ISIS that came on, which was an offshoot of that. And there was, at one point, there were 1,000 different groups all around the country. And that was good in one sense and terrible for the sense of unity. It was good that the regime, when it was fighting on so many different fronts, but it was bad because without unity and unity of purpose and direction, what happened later and continues to happen is this division between people on religious and ethnic
this
lines.
is one of the things we've seen before. I mean, if you look at Libya, it's like it's totally destroyed from the country it used to be. Even if you take into account all the atrocities of perhaps its leader, and if you look at Afghanistan, it's similar. I mean, a lot of places where wars and civil wars do take place, what tends to happen is then the country gets divided into various lines and factions. Is there any lessons being learned about that?
I think that, as I was just speaking to some people right now in Syria before I came onto this program, trying to get the latest about Idlib in itself. And Idlib has been, essentially, it is now besieged from the air. and from the ground. The one lesson I can tell you that's happened in every single period of time is that if you don't have an air force, you're essentially going to be decimated, pulverized and bombed into submission. That's what happened in Afghanistan. It's what happened in Libya. It's happened everywhere. The air force, whoever controls an air force, controls the ability to do the most damage. And so now, whether in Syria, you have what I call an aerial gang rape of Syria taking place. And think of this: not since World War II have Britain, America, France, and Russia all bombed on the same side. They were all bombing in the name of killing ISIS, but the Russians, when they came in, purportedly invited by the Syrian regime, the Russians have been bombing everybody in the opposition, in the name of fighting terrorism. But the irony is, you've got an organization like Hezbollah, who are deemed terrorists around the world, fighting on the ground against the Syrian rebels in the name of fighting terrorism. So you've got every country almost you can imagine. Israel's bombing on one side or the other. Turkey's bombing. Jordan's been bombing.
There's a lot of people
everybody
that's involved here. And to the outside person that's looking into this, I mean, it's actually quite confusing. I mean, do you think, 7 years is a long time to be at a war. Do you think actually people remember what's going on? And why it all started, and that aspiration, is it all but gone now? Well,
so one of the things the brother I was speaking to just recently, he said the people who are now in Idlib constitute internally displaced people mostly. So there are people who are refugees, but from within Syria. Okay. They've fled from places like Ghouta and Homs and Hama and Aleppo, and come to the last bastion, as it were, last place to find safety. And these are the ones who cannot find themselves reconciling with the regime that has literally put their daughters in rape camps and has skinned, as I said, their children alive and burnt them and tortured them. Some of the reports of Amnesty International recently spoke about the tens of thousands of people who died in the torture chambers of the Assad regime. We've even had British individuals who've gone over to help, like Dr. Abbas Khan, who was found alive by his mother but was tortured to death days later, despite of the international pressure. So you have this kind of sense of impunity by the government, by the Assad regime. And so these people know that. These are Syrians who know the regime, and they cannot come to a point at which they say, let's sit down and negotiate with these people who have been our tormentors for years. So now they're here, they're digging in, and they're saying we're going to stay here now until either there's hope from somewhere, maybe Turkey intervenes, or we die.
I totally understand that bravery and that courage that's taken to do that, but the cost, the humanitarian cost,
is immense. It's huge. As I said, there are, the Idlib region doesn't naturally hold 3 million people. They have been pushed into this region now. Turkey is bursting. Turkey has taken about 3.5 million refugees. Jordan has taken several hundreds of thousands, and so has Lebanon. So this is the largest humanitarian catastrophe in recent times, but it's been pushed as a result of the bombing and the military intervention of the Assad regime, of the Iranians, and of the Shiite militias that come from Iraq and from even as far afield as Afghanistan. And so this is what you're finding, is this mad sectarian war on a biblical scale. Everybody believes that they're right. As Allah said in the Quran, كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Each group believes it is happy with what it has and what it's doing. And it is hard to find. The Turks have been trying to become peace brokers in this, talking to the Russians, talking to the Iranians. But we invaded Iraq, the West invaded Iraq on the notion that perhaps maybe there might be chemical weapons there. There weren't, but we still invaded. Here, chemical weapons, sarin gas and chlorine gas, have been used, and it's been documented by the United Nations, and there's absolutely nothing that anybody's done. So we can see a massive double standard.
Intervention is also quite controversial. A lot of Syrians initially did not want any intervention. So it's not that straightforward.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about intervention. If we were able to at least take out the worst culprit in this, and that is air power. From air power, you get all of these different types of ordnance and bombing happening. If they could establish a no-fly zone that was policed by countries like Turkey and others, Jordan and so forth, who are neighboring countries, then this could be something at least minimizes that kind of, but there's no international will to even do this. And I think that's a little bit, I would call it cowardice.
Yeah, no, that's true. So Idlib is a small city, 3 million people, surrounded by air and land and everything else. Are they really going to bomb them?
Well, look, Idlib is an entire province, and the Idlib city itself is quite small. There's Marat Noman later in a different part, and there's Khan Sheikhoun, and these places have been bombed at different points. The number of people that have flocked to this region are the last numbers of the rebels and those who support the idea of continuing the fight, and at the same time don't want to be taken over by the regime. You have Turkish pockets around of Turkish military that's part of the Euphrates Shield, which is near the old Kurdish areas. The Russians won't bomb around there, but they will bomb within Idlib and that region. And the potential is, if they start doing that, there will be a mass slaughter. There's no way for them to go. If the Turks don't open the borders, that means people will die where they stand. Yeah. And that means men, women and children.
Shocking to think. Okay, so we've just actually run out of time. So we're going to have a short break, viewers. Inshallah, join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum. So just before the break, I was asking Moazzam about Idlib, small place, 3 million people, surrounded. I mean, if they bomb, it's a huge humanitarian cost. Now, is there, like you said, this is the last kind of holding place for the resistance, the other side, as it were. Is the intention to basically, is the end game like we're going to bomb them out into submission? Is that what's going on? And
I think essentially yes, that's going to be. It's not necessarily that they will hit all the civilian populated areas in the way that they have done before. There will be nonetheless, as is in any aerial campaign, large numbers of civilian casualties. But their whole target is to break the resistance. Civilians are a consequence. They're not. The civilians aren't necessarily the resistance.
Well, always in war. I mean, they're the collateral.
Of course, yeah. And so it's upon any invader or any occupier or any regime to calculate how much they're willing to take in terms of that collateral damage. And so if you read what happens in Russia, for example, most people, because of the way the media works in Russia, most ordinary people don't know about the numbers of civilian casualties. It was the same in relation to Chechnya, it was the same in relation to Afghanistan. Yeah. Russian people are told they're just fighting a terrorist insurgency. Yeah. And so the language of the war on terrorism, although Assad and the regime there was cited by Bush once as the axis of evil, when it comes to Muslims asserting themselves in any kind of political sense, everybody's using the language of the war on terror.
A lot of our viewers probably watching. I mean, one of the things exactly what you just said is this whole thing is very confusing. 1 minute they're terrorists, they're axis of evil. Next minute we're supporting them. We're supporting their resistance, and we're not supporting them. I mean, how does anyone ever keep up with what's going on?
It's almost impossible to. You can't. Today, for example, the Assad regime was working hand in glove with the United States of America on the rendition program. So there's people I know, and they used to threaten me when I was held by the Americans, that if you don't cooperate, we'll send you to Assad, we'll send you to Syria, as they had done so. And so behind the scenes, they were always working together, or they worked with the Gaddafi regime and so forth on the renditions program. Recently, it's come to light. So it is confusing for anybody. And the only thing you can really come to in the end is that people's interests change all the time, and their alliances change all the time.
So there's a question I have to ask you this, and it's I think on a lot of people's mind was this uprising, was it worth it?
If you ask the people who were subjected to the oppression of the past 30 to 40, 50 years, I think they're the most qualified to say. Of course, there are contingents of people who support the Assad regime who will say it's better. But if you ask those people who were in the tortured... I mean, I tell you, one of the stories I used to hear from the brothers in Syria, even before the uprising, they said that one of the things they would make you to do in the prisons is to see how much of a Muslim you are. They take the Quran, rip its pages off, and ask you to wipe your backside with it. And if you did, you get free. And if you didn't... Now, these are stories I heard from Syrian brothers themselves. This was before the revolution happened. So this is one simple kind of example. As I said to you, the renditions program, Maher Arar, who's a Canadian Syrian, was held in a place called Farah, Palestine, which is a Palestine branch, which is in Damascus, where he was held in a coffin alive for 10 months and he had just holes to breathe from. This is just a snapshot of the types of torture that happened. When the uprising began, the torture was meted at new levels. So, of course, for those people, if you ask them, you've been living under this type of thing for the past 30 to 40 years. You've seen your parents. I mean, there's one brother I met. He was in prison for 16 years in the Tadmor prison. They poked his eye out. The only reason why he managed to survive and live was because when his number for execution would get called out, somebody walked in his place. And otherwise, and he told me, today I'm standing up with my whole village, standing up against the regime, and we are now free, even if they kill us.
Well, I suppose there's a price to pay for kind of freedom and that kind of stuff. I mean, are we at the end game? Is this like, you know, is Idlib the last kind of resistance place? I mean, is the war coming to an end?
It may be, but, you know, the 3 million people, I mean, you know, let's talk about some of the militias that exist, the groups, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Harar al-Sham, Faylaq al-Rahman. There's all these different groups that exist within the Haras ad-Din. They will fight, and they're in their thousands. So what may happen is if the Assad regime takes over and they bomb them into submission, these groups will take up to become guerrilla fighters. So the war won't stop, and that's kind of the nature.
Is there a common interest? Do you think, like, you know, I mean, you talked about freedom, you know, moving away from oppression, you know, all of the hardships that people faced, you know, they wanted a better life. That's what was the cause of it. And now, after 7 years, with so many different things, you know, you mentioned about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, all of that kind of stuff, so many different issues and everything else. Is the outcome, the objective is that same? Does all the different groups that you just mentioned, 5, 6 of them, do they all want the same thing? I
don't know if they all necessarily want the same thing. I don't know. One thing they're all agreed upon. All of the rebel groups are agreed upon that they want to get rid of the regime. Now it's the clocks. It's turned back. Everything's turned back. So now the regime is getting rid of them. That's but what's happened is, you can see in this picture, this Syria looks like this now. So major cities in Syria that were some of the most beautiful parts of the Arab world, and places that were protected, old places that have been around for hundreds of years are now destroyed. The old parts of Damascus, the old parts of Aleppo and so forth. But this is a price that people were willing to pay because they felt that what else was going on was far greater. Now, the victory and defeat are all in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't know where that lies. And people may turn around and say that it wasn't worth it. Thus far, the people I'm speaking to in Idlib, they say we believe everything was worth it, in terms of at least we stood up to the tyrant. And if the tyrant used those very weapons, chemical weapons, for example, and even conventional weapons, to destroy us, barrel bombs, indiscriminate bombs, not differentiating between men, women and children. If the tyrant used more tyranny to harm us, then who is responsible for that, us or him?
No, and that's a really good point. But I think, you know, one of the kind of discussions a lot of people have is that, you know, that there is this feeling that, you know, if we change the regime, it will be better. And this is what their objective was. But sometimes, you know, as we saw in Egypt, just getting a regime
it's
change,
not enough. Of course, it's not.
Doesn't make any
I mean,
difference.
you know, ultimately, if you look at the cost, people will, you know, 500,000, maybe more. That numbers are. People can say in hindsight that it wasn't the right thing to do. There's many people who are saying that. But the people, as I said, that I'm speaking to in Idlib aren't the ones who are saying it. And it's because, as I said, they have fled the regime, and they have fled because they've seen what the regime has done to them over all this period, and they're just not prepared to live under it.
Well, I mean, it's very noble, but, you know, the cost. So you mentioned Iran, Turkey, you know, Russia, UK and other countries, European countries. I'm sure a lot of them are involved. The cost on Syria itself is, I mean,
it's indescribable. I mean, the cost.
What about the cost on Turkey and others? You know, taking on the refugees,
I think it's a very good point.
Else? I mean,
I think that's
what happens with all of this?
So this is a really good point. So we in the West here, in Britain and elsewhere, always talk about. In fact, the far right has risen so much in Britain and Europe and in America that it's almost unrecognizable. And part of the reason is because of refugees, refugees from war zones. And one of them is Kurdish refugees, Afghan refugees, and Syrian refugees. They are now, we see them dying on the coasts of the Mediterranean and trying to get over here. It's as if we're flooded by refugees. But the truth is the countries that are flooded by refugees are Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. They've taken the brunt of these wars. And there's even refugees from Syria going into Iraq. They're that desperate. Yeah. So what we've got really is an unrecognized contribution by some of these countries, especially Turkey, in terms of, if you see some of the refugee centers they've built up, they're like little mini towns with everything, with schools, playgrounds, access to medical facilities, to water, sanitation. They've done what few countries have done. I've seen refugee camps in Pakistan of the Afghans. I've seen refugee camps, in Bosnia and elsewhere. And people had neighboring countries didn't take on the burden of the war next door in this way, and they have to be commended. And you don't see Turkey complaining as much, the population saying that we are sick and tired of the refugees, though it must be a massive burden. Yeah. But we complain more about it in Britain, we have maybe a few hundred refugees, than a country that has a few million. So the context is just,
it's a good point. It's a good point.
That in mind.
I think a lot of people forget the sheer kind of responsibility and burden that neighbouring countries do take on when they do this. But it's the right thing to do, I suppose. I mean, we're coming near the end. I mean, what do you think? I mean, viewers watching this, seeing this, I saw on social media there's a lot of people that are upset, they're worried, that they're making dua. I mean, what can people do? Because it's not a one-off thing. This is continuously happening.
Personally, if you ask me. It's hard not to feel downbeat about this, hard not to feel that this is the end game, that whatever's going to happen, the regime's going to take over, and either there'll be a mass exodus or mass killing, or people will just surrender en masse, and then the regime will pick literally up people and torture them and imprison them for having taken part in this rebellion. So the prospects don't look good. So the only response they can have is to stand firm. That's the only option they have. They don't have another option. Turkey doesn't want to open its borders to allow another 3 million to flood into its country. It can only take so many people. So what option do they have? The only other option is that there's a corridor, safe corridor, and that there's a protection zone. But even that, how long will that last? Because Turkey can only sustain it for so long. The Syrian regime will say, these are terrorists, we need to wipe them out. Yeah. And without the political will to defend them, I don't know what's going to happen. So I think they're going to be at a stalemate. And Syria is in a very strong position. It has an international superpower backing it, whereas the Syrians, the rebels, have nobody but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, no, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of helpers. But just what for our viewers, is there anything they can get involved with to kind of, I don't know, keep an eye on, be witness to what's going on?
Of course, I mean there are. Of course, it's limited. There's nothing we can do really about the military situation. What we can do is make sure that we're informed. Look at the various sources. There are people. There's journalists like OGN Bilal Abdul Karim, who's out there, who's constantly reporting from inside. He's the only Western reporter that's inside that region in Idlib, reporting from there. There are people that you can see on social media, Dr. Shajul Islam, and all the work that he's doing in the hospitals. One of the things that he told me before was that the hospitals themselves, they've built them into the mountains so that they can avoid airstrikes. But what the Russians have done is developed and used weapons that are designed to damage and break those hospitals. So the targeting of medical facilities in war, by the way, is a war crime. But again, these are war crimes that go unpunished. So people need to know that this is going on. People need to understand that we, of course, need to make dua at the most important times, to make dua for these people, to support the various humanitarian organizations that exist within the Muslim community and beyond, and help them in the aid effort. They go out into aid convoys and send aid containers to the neighboring regions. And of course, make sure that whenever we're able to speak about the subject, to do so.
No, I think that's the bare minimum we can do, is be a witness to. Jazakumullah khair, Moazzam, for joining me today for the program. And Jazakumullah khair to you all for watching. Hope you got something out of this program. And, like Moazzam says, do make dua and be a witness. Assalamu alaikum.
watching. We know you.